Welcome back to the course Globalization and Housing Risks of Chinese Young People. And this is the second section, Risks of the Post-18 Generations. In this video, I'll introduce the social risks faced by young people who were born after 1980 and therefore before 1989. In China, we call them post-18ers. First, I'll introduce the demography, education, occupation, and income of these so-called post-18ers. Then, I'll focus on two groups of post-18ers who faced extreme challenges, the rural migrant workers and the single child. Let's look at some simple facts about the post-18ers. The total population of this post-18 group is 213 million. Among them, 19% is single child, which means that this young people is the only child of his or her biological parents. It might be a surprise to you, as you probably have heard about China's famous one-child policy. That's because only urban families who are employed by public sectors are strictly required to have only one child, and rural families and families in some areas are allowed to have more than one. 20% post-18ers is university graduates. 77% of the post-18ers were born in countryside, and 23% were born in the cities, and 44% of them is rural migrant workers. One interesting thing is the unnatural sex rate of 108 boys to 100 girls, which is believed to be caused by gender-selected abortion. The post-18ers have experienced expansion in both basic and high education. In the beginning of the reform, enrollment rate of middle and high schools have actually dropped because of the high cost of education and more opportunities to move to coastal areas to work. The government increased the support to poor students and also increased provision of secondary education. From 1994, enrollment rate has returned to the level of 1978. So for the post-18 generation, the education received was much better than previous generations. From the end of 1990s, higher education began to expand in rapid speed. This line shows the percentage of high school graduates who were enrolled into universities and colleges. And the other line shows absolute number of undergraduate students. The number of recruited students increased about 20% every year. I'm a beneficiary of this policy personally. Because of this enlargement, I got the chance to go to a good university. Higher enrollment rate didn't decrease the competitiveness of schools, because good resources are always scarce. The picture on the right shows a very typical scene of a high school classroom, with students sitting in front of desk full of practice books. Students in high schools have to study very hard to pass the entrance exams and to go to universities. In the meanwhile, as the number of university graduates increases, the job market didn't increase proportionally. So the result is a depreciation of the credential. 20 years ago, university graduates can get a stable and high-paid job easily, but that's no longer the case for the post-18 generations. Some university graduates cannot find a job after graduation, and that's partly because of the education they received in schools were not matched with the needs of employers on the market very well. Along with rising enrollment rate in general, the gap between rural and urban students become substantial. 80% of urban youth hold high school or higher level diploma, but only 25% of rural youth did so. As I have already mentioned, globalization and the opening up of many low-skill manufacturing jobs in the coastal areas attracted many students with poor family background to drop out and to start working in a young age. The high cost and low immediate return further discouraged the rural families to send their children to schools instead of to work. In this graph, on the left, you can see the percentage of students which continue in the middle schools, high schools, and colleges. In the middle school level, the students with a rural background is still doing well, but in high schools and particularly universities and colleges, the percent is much lower compared to students with an urban background. Before the reform, there was low labor market in China. Economic resources and social status of individuals, which goes with the jobs, are managed with central planning and administrative allocation. Upon graduation, a student will receive a piece of paper indicating which work unit he or she should report to, as is showing in this slide. The graduates couldn't choose a job from the market freely, but after the reform, China merged into the global industrial division and commercial exchange. The workers can freely apply and change jobs, and the companies can freely hire people and give them salaries which matches the ability and capacity. Salary becomes measurable criteria to judge the successfulness of a person. This picture down there shows a job fair where all the employers can set up a booth and all the graduates can submit their resumes and talk to their employers on the spot. In order to establish such a freely mobile labor market and to increase efficiency, the so-called iron rice bowl is smashed. Employment before reform is permanent, but now it all becomes employment contracts with fixed service years. Factories and companies are the ones to use unprotected contracts and low salary to compete in international market. Later, even for public utilities and government departments use more flexible employment contracts to improve efficiency. This picture depicts the protesting workers who are laid off by a state-owned company. In the meanwhile, many benefits provided in socialist system is cancelled to lower the cost, and the workers have to bear expensive consumption in housing, child education, and healthcare, which were provided to them almost for free in the socialist system. I have mentioned in the first part that the average wage rose sixfold between 1978 and 2005, but the benefits are not enjoyed equally or egalitarianly. The return of education increased, but the benefits were mainly taken by youngsters who were born in the cities. The marketization of higher education knocked out those who cannot afford it. The introduction of free labor market destroyed the stability of education investment. The latter made it hard for rural students who finished higher education but have no good social connection to find a high-income job and return their education investments. This picture on the left presents two young adults. They might have the same educational level and skills, but because their family backgrounds are different, their position of competitions are very different. Another picture on the right shows a young man and his father who used to be the richest man in China. And this young man represents a typical phenomenon. He's a successful investor and entrepreneur who started his business with his family wealth. Early on, I have mentioned that 77% of post-18 generations were born in rural area, and 54% of post-18 generation is rural migrant workers. So there is about 100,000 young adults who were born as farmers, but hardly done any agricultural works. They go to schools in the countryside after graduated from middle or high schools and go to work in the cities. As a teenager, many of them have grew up in the cities with their migrant worker parents and eager to become a real urbanet and white-collar worker. They have high expectations on consumption and quality life, but can hardly work on any professional job due to their poor education, especially because many of them were separated from their migrant worker parents, and some of them have mental issues or problems in their personalities. Global financial crisis had an impact on them, as demands for export rapidly decreased. According to statistics, 20 million migrant workers had lost their jobs in 2009. Chinese government noticed the imbalance of export and domestic consumption, so the policies started to level out the preferential policies between foreign and export-oriented companies and local companies and products for domestic markets. Domestic consumption slowly grows. Economic opportunities improved in inland provinces, so the migrant workers can find jobs in nearby cities and even local communities. From 2017 onward, policies started to encourage them to settle down in near-home small cities and to endure public services to the migrants. There are also policies to support returned migrant workers to start businesses and to help the destitute. According to 2010 census, 90% of the post-18 group is single child, which means they are the only child of their biological parents and have no siblings. This is a direct result of the rigorous state policy. The birth control policy initiated in 1980s. It's applied regularly in the cities and among public employers and somewhat loosely in rural areas. This policy is finally called an end in 2014, but the status of extremely low fertility rate can no longer be reversed. The total fertility rate in China is around 1.8 now. By estimation, birth control policies had reduced the new births of 400 billion population. It saves the resources to raise babies, which will be non-active economically for 20 years, and to develop a modernized country as soon as possible. Birth control policy had diversified outcomes in micro level. For one thing, the decrease of child number largely increased the family's investment on existing one or two children. The physical and mental developments as well as educational achievements of the single child is much improved compared to non-single child. Birth control policy also improves gender equality. For girls without male siblings, they received all affections and resources of their families. On the other hand, the rigor birth control policy makes China age in rapid speed and calls for a care crisis. Many families now have a 4-to-1 structure. That means a young couple needs to support four senior parents plus their child, one or two. For families who lost their only child accidentally, and 2000 census shows that there were 670,000 families. The seniors suffered for loneliness and inadequate care in old age.